Well, look who's back. Tess
Yeah,
Gerritsen is back. Tess, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's fun. It's fun to be back with a totally new project.
Yeah. Listen, when we talked, we were just kibitzing ever so briefly before our conversation. And the last time I talked to you, you had released Choose Me, which
Mhm.
was, I think, your first co-authored book. Well, I know it was co-authored. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it was. And then ever since then, I've done two more books. So I guess it's been a while.
No, not that long, because the rate at which you write books is, different than others who might need 5 years. You don't need that much time. You
Well,
get it.
I'm that fast. At the most, I'll do a book a year. But there are people who manage to turn
Oh,
a few more.
I'm sure you've met them. So you try for about a book a year. Yeah.
I did, and then I got older, and I said, "Hey, wait a minute! It's time to stop and smell the roses." So yeah, I'm slowing down a little bit.
But we're on book number 30 something, right? Are we? Isn't that kind of what we're clocking in at? Are we
I
in the
think this is
30s?
31.
All
31,
right.
yeah.
All right. Well, congrats. Still going. Um, so you've also moved into, well, actually, I want to back up for our listeners, for our viewers. Um, Tess, I discussed this when we talked last, but it's kind of interesting to return to that. Your first career was in uh, you were a doctor. You
Mhm.
began and like a lot of people, I asked, but I knew the reason that you chose to be a doctor, not a writer. Even though you've been writing all your life, you'd always wanted to be a writer. You'd loved it since you were a little girl. For very practical reasons, it seemed more rational to go get your MD. And you were from immigrant parents. So you were Chinese American. Your parents, were they immigrants themselves?
Yeah, my mother was an immigrant,
Okay.
and you know how immigrants are. Where there's like
I
everything is about security, right?
I totally know. My wife and friends. Anyway, so yeah, and so Bo be a doctor, and so you went and became a doctor. Are your parents still around?
No, they passed on, but
Okay.
my mother was around long enough to really appreciate that I had a new career.
That was
Um,
my question. That was my question is like, what did they think of this? Because this is not what they expected for their daughter.
no, they didn't. Now my father unfortunately could not appreciate that
Oh,
I
that's
had
too
moved
bad.
career. But my mom always loved scary stuff. You know, she was a big horror film fanatic, and she loved the fact that I was writing scary books. Although she had to say, moms sometimes are never happy with what you do. She said my books could be scarier.
Now, I have a theory about that. Tess, which is because she knew you wrote it. She knew her daughter wrote it. Because here's the thing, all the movies she watches and all the books she's read have been written by mysterious people that she's never met. And so the way the book exists as if it just grew out of the ground, but she knows the girl who wrote it. And don't you think, I'm just theorizing, that takes away a layer of the willing suspension of disbelief that's necessary for scary things?
Well, I think what it is, you're never a prophet in your own town. It's a
Right.
that with your family. Your family's always, oh yeah, it's pretty good, but it's yours. So
Yeah. Do you ever talk to them in your mind? I don't know what your thoughts are on the hereafter, but your dad who didn't get to see, and he was the one who was really like, you're going to go be a doctor. And now
right.
that you're having this fabulous career as a writer, do you ever converse with them just in your mind?
I think in my own mind, I probably just say, Mom and Dad, I'm glad I didn't listen to you.
Good.
I'm glad I did my own thing. And that's the kind of mom I became, which is I told my kids, you do your own thing because
Yeah.
you have to follow your own path.
Well, how could you not? How could you not? How can a novelist say no? Although it was funny, there's the actor Richard Jenkins. I'm not are you familiar with him?
No, no.
He's a wonderful actor. But he got his career started in theater in Providence, where I grew up. So I used to see him in these very local theater shows. I thought that guy's great. Now he's in movies. And I listened to him being interviewed by Mark Maron on his podcast. And his son was a great drummer, but he's like, he gave it up to become an accountant. He's like, that's my real passion. And he was kind of like, no son of mine is going to be. Anyway, so here you are, an artist. How can you not tell your kids to pursue their passions, right?
Right. I mean, that would be hypocritical of me, wouldn't it?
I think so. In our conversation, you also mentioned something interesting in that I said that doctors, I've interviewed a number of doctors who become writers, and you thought that was interesting because doctors tend to deal in facts, right? In
Right.
science. But there's also this, which I think is interesting, which is there's creating stories, right? There's what you dream up stories, and then there's storytelling. And I had a client who helped people write TED Talks. She wrote them for them. She would work with scientists, and she said the scientists had these great discoveries and this great information, but they could not, for the life of them, structure that in a story because there's right. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, you're using a different part of your brain, actually.
It is, yeah.
When you're writing a scientific paper or you're writing a medical note, you try to stick to the facts. You try to be very precise. And storytelling is all about making the circles, circling around the impactful part of your paper.
Just describe that. To go in, do you mind just exploring that? What do you mean by circling around? How
Well, when you have a thriller, it's usually somebody dies and then there's a conclusion and the detective finds it. You don't want to go from point A to point Z in lightning speed. You are taking your time. You're going around to the dark alleys and these circles because your hero. That is the fun of reading these, is that you don't get from A to Z in a straight line. It has to
right.
Yeah.
Right, because you kind of that's the interesting thing I always feel for the genre writers, whether it's crime or romance, but specifically crime. To some degree, the reader sits down and already knows some things about your book, whether they've ever they know. Like when I watched a little bit of the Jack Ryan series when I was laid up after an operation recently, and I knew nothing was going to happen to Jack Ryan, no matter how bad things got, because the thing is named after him. And so I just know he's going to be okay. And the reader knows you're going to catch the killer. Unless you're into something different, which most crime, unless you're really going somewhere. And so don't you as a writer have to work with the knowledge that they know what's coming and yet still make them feel like maybe this time it won't happen?
Well, yeah, no, I think it's how you get there that's entertaining. Okay, so you can take all kinds of detours, and people will follow you on these detours. They know what the destination is, but they don't know if you're going to go to Pittsburgh or you're going to go to Alabama first before you get there.
That's right. And so when you're, because who was it I was interviewing? Martha Grimes, I think it might have been she, who said she just puts the body down and says, let's go find out who killed, and she'll start writing. No idea who killed him, just follow along. Where are you on that arc of outlining?
I am I'm a seat of the pants writer too.
Interesting. Okay.
There are times, there are certain books where I didn't know until 3/4 of the way through the first draft who the bad guy was.
Really? Yes. 3/4?
Sometimes it takes 3/4, or sometimes I'll get to the end and I'll think, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right. It feels like I've missed something. Like your detectives on the shows.
You're like a detective in your own book.
Right. It's like, okay, I've got the bad guy. Oh, but something doesn't feel right. And then you go back and look at it and think, oh, there's somebody I missed. And that's happened at least maybe 1/4 of the time in my manuscripts. But it's always the first draft.
Yeah. Always the first draft. So that's interesting. And how often do you have, as you get to the end and you say, oh, I see how we're going to wrap it up, do you look back at chapter 3 and go, oh, look at that detail. Oh, that's the perfect detail that I need. Does that happen?
That happens. We subconsciously leave the gun on the mantelpiece. I think we put stuff down there. We don't know if it's going to be relevant. We don't know sometimes why we did it. But eventually you get to a point in the story when, oh, wait a minute, I can go back to that and use that gun on the mantelpiece.
Don't you think, because I am a pantser too. I don't write fiction, but I write creative nonfiction. You would think if you write memoir-y stuff like I do, that I wouldn't need to outline, but in fact I often don't know what the story is about, even though I say I'm going to write about when this thing happened. I don't know why I'm writing it, right? I don't know what to include and what to leave out. Don't you feel like there's a certain discipline necessary with pantsing, which is to say to know when you're going down a blind alley, to know what it feels like when you're starting down a blind alley, as opposed to putting down, like you said, a detail is like, I don't know why that belongs, but I feel like I should leave it. Right? Isn't there like a thing you have to learn to tell the difference between?
I don't know if there's discipline involved at all.
Oh, come on. Okay.
I think you're just throwing things in the air and you want to see where it
No,
lands.
no, no. I push back. I reject it. Because on some level, you have to be able to trust, like, that feels wrong, that feels right. I don't need that. I better follow that. No?
I find myself into so many blind alleys and then I stop. I mean, that's what writer's block, or for me, it's plot block. I write so many blind alleys and then I get stuck. And then you're trying to find your way out of it. And that's when the magic happens. When you're trapped in a room. Okay, let me metaphorically trapped.
Yeah, I like it.
There's no doors, there's no windows, and then something clicks and you find, oh my God, I left a window open there, and then I can get out.
Go ahead.
No, it really is when you're trapped, when you're in the blind alley, that the most interesting things happen.
Well, that's interesting. And so, because my memory of blind alleys, and I like this metaphor because I do feel like a story's a path, right? You're following down this way and that way. One of the things I would do if I went down, I'd say, okay, I got to back up until I remember the spot where it did make sense. When I'm writing songs, the melody I'll like, that melody, I'll go back to the part of the melody I like. But you're saying, no, I'll get down to the blind alley and then sometimes I'll say, okay, I think it's not as blind as I think. I just haven't looked deeply enough.
Yeah. There are some times when okay, that's a blind alley, and then I rip up 20 pages.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. I mean, they don't always lead to genius moments. Sometimes they just lead to blind alleys. That's all.
Right. But you've seen some great creativity come out of that when your back's up against the wall a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh. I do. But I think part of the difficulty is identifying what went wrong. Identifying where you turned down the wrong way.
Right. Which was the turn? Which of the many little decisions was the one that led me to here?
Right.
Yeah.
That's not always easy to know. So very often it has to do with character. It has to do with this character would not do this thing at this time.
Right. So you got in there. You got in there and meddled with the character instead of them doing it on their own, right?
That's right. Letting the character do their own thing.
Gotta let it do it. So, okay. So The Spy Coast, brand new book. And so first of all, we're in spy territory. I know you've written plenty of thrillers. Of course, you had the Rizzoli Isles series. Is this the first time you've really dived into the world of spies, international spies, or is this familiar territory to you?
Oh, it's not familiar territory at all.
I didn't think so.
No, it's brand new. And I never intended to write a spy thriller because, I mean, what do I know about spies, right? I'm just a humble doctor. So,
okay.
And it was all inspired. I don't know if you know this, but I live in this little town in Maine. And when I moved here 3 decades ago, we made this interesting discovery about some of our neighbors. We found out that we have a lot of retired CIA that's settled in this town.
Really?
Well, it all happened because my husband had this new medical practice, and he would ask for people's their employment history just to know whether it was relevant to their health.
Right.
And occasionally he would hear somebody say, "Oh, I used to work for the government," and he'd say, "Well, what did you do for the government?" And they'd say, "I can't talk about it." So after you heard that a couple of times, we thought, what's going on in this town? Yeah.
Wow.
And we found out that on the little street where we used to live, we had spies on our 2 spies on our street. Retired.
Oh, weird.
So I got to thinking, and that they're involved in the community. They work in library committees. They just do the normal things that well-to-do retired people do. But I just wondered, what do you do when you're a retired spy? Do you get together with your friends? Do you talk about the old days? So who can you trust? And that's how I thought, well, it's interesting to look at the espionage world from the other side, from the gray-haired side, and what is it like? So that's what inspired The Spy Coast, even though I know nothing about spies.
Oh, that is so. But were you able to walk out the front door and knock on your neighbor's door and say, "I have a book I'm researching. Talk to me"?
Well, no, I didn't. I know who some of them are.
Okay.
admit that that's what they did. But they can't talk about it. So what I
Yeah.
do is I do what I normally do when I do research. I think the most important source you can find are memoirs. If you can find a good memoir,
Right.
somebody who was a non-official cover spy, they will tell things. They will blurt out things in their memoirs that you'll find valuable. And my focus on this was really on the emotional aspect of what is it like to be in this industry.
Right.
What is it like to make friends, but with ulterior motives? I mean, everything must feel a little bit ungenuine to you. And what does that
Yeah.
do to interpersonal relationships? I mean, there was one couple who were, but they were both CIA, I know, and they had exciting lives. They were young and glamorous during the Vietnam War, and then they come here, and then they get old and decrepit, and they get divorced because I think the spark has left their lives. So what is that like for people
Wow.
to deal with that?
It's such an interesting concept and aspect of it. And of course, there's all levels to spies. There's people who are spies, but they never leave CIA. They never leave the building itself, right?
Yes.
And what is it? Is it what is it? What's the name of the CIA headquarters? It's
Langley.
I was thinking anyway. And then there's people in the field, and I wonder how many of the spies are like keep a gun in their safe because you never know what people. But I would think that's the very small majority, right?
Yeah, I wanted to avoid the whole James Bond over the top stuff. I wanted to be with people who were strictly with gathering intelligence, and they did it through finding sources, and they did it through finding sources who sometimes had to risk their lives to bring back this information.
Yeah.
But they're not running around with guns. They're working on an intellectual level.
Right.
And that was what I was focused on. Just the day-to-day, making friends, cultivating assets.
I would think one of the, when I did write fiction and I did some historical stuff, the thing that always bugged me about that I found challenging about writing something about, say, the 1880s was I know what it's like to get up and just be a person in the 21st century in America. Like I know all the sort of minutia we take for granted that I just didn't know about. I only knew the macro of the 1880s, not the micro. But the micro is where stories you've got to have. So I would think in addition to the emotional element, which would be so helpful with the memoir, just the detail of like, what is it? What do you do? What does your day feel like? Right? You had to find all that stuff, right?
And that's why I say memoirs are great. Now in 1880s, you go to diaries, you find out what people ate every day, so that's really a really rich source for just the day-to-day stuff. I mean, for some of the spycraft, you have to go to CIA stuff, and find these funny little tidbits, or find these books that talk about the training, etc. But again, I wasn't focused as much on spycraft as I was on the emotional aspects of this kind of life.
Well, as well you should be, because according to your website and your publicity, this is book one in a series. Is this true? Is this the plan? What's going on? Is that just what's happening?
When I started this book, I wasn't thinking about a series.
Okay.
But I got somewhere about 3/4 and I thought, I really like these people. And they're funny, they're interesting. And what I really loved also was that it takes place in a small town like mine, where there are local police officers who are also dealing with crimes, and not knowing what to do with this circle of these retirees. I mean, why do they know so much? How do they always show up in crime scenes before I do? So it was always it's not just the conflict between Maggie Bird, my heroine's past, and an enemy that she left behind. It's also this conflict between the local cops and this group of very, very sophisticated older people. And I love that conflict because my local cop is a solid citizen who's lived in Maine she's been generations old in this little town, and she protects her town, and she doesn't know what to do with these people, and she doesn't even know who they are. It's like, who are you? Why do you know so much? So that conflict was what really drew me in, and that's what I would love to focus on is the local versus the outside world.
Oh, it's good. It's good stuff. And so you're three-quarters of the way through. You think, I like these people. I feel like I could hang around with them a bit more. And I would suspect you're at a point in your career when you went to your editor and said, hey, I'm thinking this might be a series. I would imagine he or she would say, yes, good. Yes, good. Write 4 more, please. Is that, was that their reaction, or what did they say?
Well, when I turned in the first book, I wasn't talking about a series. I just said, here's my book. Yeah.
Right.
And immediately it was, is there a second one in the series? Because they really,
okay.
and also the first book was optioned by Amazon Studios for a television series. So of course we want more of these characters, and that's how it ended up. So I'm working on the second draft now of the next book.
So you said optioned. I understand how television in Hollywood functions. Optioned is nice. Made is another thing.
Yes,
right. I mean, you've been down that road where it did actually go through, but in your gut, in your grown-up, seasoned professional's gut, what would you say the odds of it appearing on my Amazon feed are?
I'm feeling pretty good. I'm going to make a wild guess and say 50-50.
Oh,
which is really good. I mean, knowing how most options collapse.
Yeah. I remember Terry Brooks was talking about it because he wrote the sort of Shannara, I think he pronounced. And he wrote a ton of them, and Hollywood always comes knocking, and he get his hopes up and dash, and at the end he finally said, I don't care, just get as much money from these people as you can, whether they ever make it or not. Please just get because there's so much. And I was just talking to Bob Dugoni about that, and I don't know if you know Bob or not. He's another Amazon author. Yeah. He goes through a lot of the same stuff of people getting excited. Well, I hope to see it. I hope to see it, Tess, for your benefit. But you got to keep cranking them out then. You got to get a few more stories so that they don't, maybe you don't want those writers to mess it up.
This is how Hollywood works, right? They get your characters, they get your book, and then they have a writer's room and they start writing their own stories. They break their own stories.
Yeah.
That's Rizzoli and Dial. So they don't have to follow a book necessarily, but they follow the book as a blueprint for the characters. That's what they're really going for.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all right, 50-50. We'll keep our fingers crossed. We'll keep our fingers crossed. So you're still interested? You're still interested, Tess? 30 books in? I think it's a reasonable question. You can look up and say, I just want to play the piano for the rest of my life. I mean, what?
Okay, you're getting me at the worst time of
I am
cycle because I'm in the middle of the rewrite, and when I'm going, oh my God, this piece of what? How am I going to fix this, right? So this is always the point when I'm the most depressed when I'm writing a book. It's when I finish the first draft, I'm looking at this, working on the second draft, and I see all the flaws. So yeah, at this point, I'm going, why am I putting myself through this? Why would I think that I would want to do this a 33rd time? and talk to me in a year. Maybe I'll be different.
This is so funny. Who did I talk to? I just talked to another author. I said, what's your favorite part? He said, the rewrite. That first rewrite. That's when I really have fun.
Oh God. Well, that's not for me.
I think and so you don't like it because even though you're currently rewriting book 32. Yeah. And even though you've done 31 of these and you've sold a lot of copies of books and you've done this before, some part of you thinks, oh, this is the time. This might be the one where Tess Gerritsen can't close the deal. Does that just float around your head a little bit? Just the smallest bit of that?
And you know what's worse? The worst thing, the weirdest thing about it is that the reviews on the Spy Coast are so good. The reader reviews are so good.
Great.
It makes me anxious.
Oh, you don't want to disappoint them.
I don't want to disappoint for the next book. So it's like, I shouldn't be looking at good reviews right now. I should just looking at bad reviews.
No, see, this is I am evangelical about this, which is forget the reviews. I know, because you live by them, you die by them, and it's like, so now you read them, you think they love it. Oh God, I hope I don't screw it up. They don't like you, think, what's wrong with it? Just you're just in these people's heads. My wife,
never be happy. You can never be happy.
You can't, and it's like you want people to like your stuff, of course, right? But it's sort of like, it's weird. I don't know if you go through this test, but because my stuff is pretty personal, but I realize when people come and talk to me about something of mine they've read, I still feel like they're describing an experience they had that I wasn't really a part of. Like they were there by themselves reading it. And so it's like almost their book. I mean, I know they didn't write it, but it's really their experience. And I'm not a part of it at all in a lot of ways. Do you ever get that sense yourself? Like,
Except my name's on it.
yeah, I know, but it's sort of like, oh, I don't know. I have a thing like it belongs to them at that point, even though I wrote it. And
Yeah. Well, I feel that way about television. Once they take it, it's
oh yeah,
I have to add it. But that whole reader writer relationship, it's very fraught, right?
yeah.
I mean, it's how many other professions other than entertainment do you have your work review put out there in public?
Never.
Like everyone
No
can
one.
see that somebody hated what you did.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're a teacher, your work review is very private. It's between you and your employer. But everybody reads our work reviews. And I think that this adds a lot of stress to what we do.
You know, who was, I always forget her name when I tell the story. She was the American painter, did all the stuff in the Southwest with the skulls and, you know, the cow skulls.
Oh, Georgia O'Keeffe.
Georgia O'Keeffe. Loved, you know, she has a famous quote about it, which is she said, I decided for myself, and praise and criticism went down the same drain, and I was free. And I thought, oh, because like we put ourselves out there, but we cannot live by what other people think of our stuff. Like it'll kill us. We'll spend a whole days batting around. It takes great discipline, Tess. I think you got it. Obviously, you've survived. You haven't been killed by an ulcer. You're still able to do this and enjoy it mostly. So finishing this. So this is book number 2 of this series, obviously. Yeah. And do you feel within your creative gut that there could be a third? Is that a possibility?
Yeah. You know, first of all, I never planned to write number 2, and now now they're saying, "Oh, you're going to write a third." So I have an idea. I live in as I said, a very peculiar little town with a lot of spies here, and believe it or not, this is the idea for the third one. Is that for a little town in Maine, we attract these really high-powered international people who come here every year for a conference. It's like a national conference. And you know that a lot of the people who are sitting in that opera house are retired spies. So that idea came to me.
Oh my God.
Why not write a novel that's set around this international conference in this little town? Because it happens. I mean, it's not pure fiction. It's just,
well, you know what's great about that is because you're making stuff up, obviously, you're inventing. But when you start with something so real, like for instance, having a town full of spies, you know, that can seem like a writer's dream, but you started with reality, and just built off of it. And same thing, I think it gives it a level of verisimilitude that sometimes a crime novel might not have, or certain crime novels might not have. So that's got to feel good, give you a little confidence.
It does, and the fact that there are stories all around me, like the second book I'm writing is based on something the CIA did here, 50 years ago. So again, it's based on some kind of kernel of truth.
Do you watch the news differently, international news, because now that you know a little bit more than you did before, or has it not changed your view of the world at all?
Well, it does make me imagine what people are doing, running around behind the scenes, gathering this information, gathering this intelligence, what they're putting their lives through and their assets' lives through. It gives you a better appreciation of how something that happens in Israel or Gaza or Korea, it does affect us right here, even in the most calm part of the country.
We are all interconnected. It is.
We are
all interconnected. Does any part of you reading about these and writing about these people think, I'd have made a good spy? I could have done it.
No,
I'm smart.
No, I would have been a terrible spy.
You would have been?
I would have been a terrible spy. I'm not a good liar. I would, after a while, I would have said, I confess.
You are it's a weird thing. Writers lie for a living. And yet there's one thing to lie on the page. There's nothing to lie to a person, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very true. And also I'm basically I'm a coward. So don't send me into a war zone, please.
Good thing to know about yourself. Okay. So the Spy Coast, go get it, people. It's good. It's different. Tess is taking different roads. You can get it where all fine books are sold. All right. So last time I asked you what writing has taught you. Here's what I want to find out, what I want to know. I usually ask, what has writing's taught you? Anything has taught you what? And I got to say that question changes. My answer changes. But here's what I'm interested in, because you're still doing this. What about writing right now? Because you keep growing, I hope, right? You keep changing aside from new stories. What is it that's on? What about writing do you think about the most these days? Is there some aspect of it that's particularly you're chewing on, or that you're focused on? Is there some aspect of it in particular right now at this point in your life compared to 30 years ago or 20 years ago?
I don't think so. I think it's still a story comes to you and you still want to see it on the page. And it's a compulsion. Okay. It's not a healthy compulsion. It's something we admit that we are obsessed with this kind of stuff, and maybe sometimes it ruins our lives. But I've come to accept that part of my own personality, is that I'm an obsessive person.
But it's a good obsession. So if I heard you correctly, that experience of a story coming to you and you wanting to see it on the page is not completely different than when you were 7 years old and you wrote your first story.
No, it's the same. I haven't changed since I was 7.